Melanie Brooks had always been proud of her ability to plan meticulously. As a professional interior design consultant, she had built a reputation for transforming cluttered, uninviting spaces into havens of comfort and style. But her latest move wasn't about work, it was personal. She had spent years in a fast-paced city environment, juggling demanding clients, late-night revisions, and endless meetings. By the time she hit her mid-30s, Melanie realized she needed a change. The dream of escaping to a quiet suburban neighborhood, where she could finally breathe and enjoy her life, had become an almost desperate necessity. Her new home was everything she had imagined: a charming two-story house with a spacious backyard overlooking a dense grove of trees. It wasn't perfect, there were things that needed attention, like the slightly peeling paint on the back patio and the outdated basement she planned to convert into her dream office, but that was part of the allure. Melanie loved projects, and this house was her biggest one yet. She pictured herself working on her designs from the peaceful comfort of the basement, her favorite records playing softly in the background, while sunlight streamed through the high windows. From the moment she moved in, the neighbors seemed friendly enough. A retired couple from next door brought over a homemade pie, and another neighbor across the street offered tips about which local contractors were reliable. They also mentioned that the neighborhood had a very active community association. Melanie had nodded politely, not giving it much thought. She wasn't opposed to such organizations, but she had no interest in getting involved in their activities. Her house was a personal retreat, not a social hub. For the first few weeks, everything went smoothly. Melanie spent her days unpacking and planning her renovations. She had already scheduled an electrician to update the basement's wiring and was sketching ideas for new flooring. Occasionally, she'd find little notices in her mailbox, reminders from the local association about lawn maintenance or rules about holiday decorations, but they didn't bother her. It was all part of suburban life, she assumed. One crisp morning, Melanie woke up early, ready to tackle her to-do list. She brewed a cup of coffee and stepped out onto her back patio, admiring the golden light filtering through the trees. It was a quiet, serene moment, exactly what she had hoped for when she left the city. But her peace was shattered by the sound of heavy machinery. Frowning, she looked over the railing and froze. A group of construction workers was milling around her backyard, some unloading equipment from a truck parked near the edge of her property, while others were marking the ground with spray paint. Melanie quickly set her coffee down and rushed over, calling out to the workers. "Excuse me. What's going on here? Why are you on my property?" One of the men, a foreman judging by his clipboard, turned to her with a friendly but dismissive smile. "Good morning. We're here to start construction on the new community water park project. Shouldn't take more than a couple of weeks. Don't worry, Ma Am will keep it tidy." Melanie stared at him, stunned. "A water park? On my property? No one told me about this, and I certainly didn't agree to it." The foreman shrugged and flipped through his papers. It was all approved by the association. They sent notices to everyone months ago. Says here that this part of your yard is allocated for community use under some easement agreement. You'd have to take it up with them if you've got concerns. Melanie felt her stomach churn. She had read her property documents thoroughly before buying the house. There was no mention of an easement, let alone permission for something as intrusive as a water park. "This is a mistake," she said firmly. "You need to stop right now." The foreman hesitated, glancing at his workers. "Look, lady, I'm just following instructions. If you've got an issue, take it up with the association. We're just here to do the job." Before she could say anything else, one of the workers fired up a jackhammer, its deafening noise drowning out her protests. Furious and confused, Melanie stormed back into her house and grabbed her phone. She immediately called the association's office, but her calls went straight to voicemail. She left a sharp message demanding an explanation and sat down at her kitchen table, her mind racing. This couldn't be legal, she thought. No one could just barge onto private property and start building without permission. But as the day went on, and the workers continued their loud, disruptive work in her yard, Melanie began to realize that she might be dealing with something more complicated than a simple misunderstanding. By late afternoon, the construction crew had left, leaving behind a yard that looked like a war zone. The once pristine grass was torn up, and muddy tire tracks crisscrossed the space. A section of her sprinkler system was clearly damaged, and a large pile of dirt was heaped near the edge of her patio. Melanie walked around in disbelief, snapping pictures with her phone. She would need all the evidence she could gather. As the sun set and the sky turned a bruised shade of purple, Melanie sat in her living room, staring out at her ruined backyard. The association still hadn't returned her calls, and her frustration was giving way to a creeping sense of dread. She had moved here for peace and stability, but now it felt like she was trapped in some kind of surreal nightmare. For the first time since moving in, Melanie regretted leaving the city. She had dealt with noise, congestion, and difficult landlords before, but at least there her home had been her sanctuary. Now she wasn't even sure if this place was really hers. The next morning, Melanie woke to the sound of heavy machinery again, this time starting even earlier. She pulled on her robe, marched out into the backyard, and found the construction crew back at it, now laying the foundation for what appeared to be a massive water slide. Sections of brightly colored plastic tubing were scattered across the torn-up grass, and several workers were huddled over blueprints spread out on the hood of a truck. Melanie didn't hesitate. She walked straight to the foreman she'd spoken with the day before. "I told you this is my property, and you need to stop construction," she said, her voice rising above the noise of a running generator. "I haven't agreed to this, and I'm demanding that you leave until this is resolved." The foreman didn't even look up from his clipboard. "Ma'am, we've got a contract. If you've got a problem, you need to take it up with the board." Melanie felt her patience snap. "I've already left messages with them, and no one has called me back. Until I get an answer, you have no right to continue this work." Finally, the foreman sighed and set down his clipboard. "Look, I don't want any trouble, but I've got orders. My guys are on the clock, and we're not stopping unless someone higher up tells us to." Melanie clenched her fists, knowing she wasn't going to get anywhere with him. She turned back toward the house and immediately called the number for the association again. This time she didn't bother with politeness. "This is Melanie Brooks at 14 Ashwood Lane, and I need to speak to someone immediately. There is unauthorized construction happening on my property, and if I don't hear back within the hour, I will be contacting an attorney." She hung up, her heart pounding, and paced around the kitchen while she waited for a response. Her frustration only grew as the minutes ticked by with no call. She decided to review her property documents again, certain there had to be some mistake. Pulling out the thick folder she'd kept in a drawer, she flipped through the pages, scanning for any mention of an easement or shared access agreement. Nothing. Every document clearly indicated that the backyard was entirely hers, with no conditions or exceptions. An hour passed, then two, and still no response from the association. Determined not to be ignored, Melanie decided to visit their office in person. She changed into jeans and a sweater, grabbed her folder of documents, and drove across town to the nondescript building that housed the local board. The receptionist barely glanced up when Melanie entered. "Can I help you?" she asked in a tone that suggested she'd rather be anywhere else. "Yes," Melanie said firmly, placing her folder on the counter. "I need to speak with someone about the construction happening on my property. It's unauthorized, and I need answers." The receptionist gave her a practiced smile. "Do you have an appointment?" "I've left multiple messages. No one has returned my calls. This is urgent." The woman sighed and typed something into her computer. One moment she disappeared into a back office, leaving Melanie standing there, tapping her fingers against the counter. When the receptionist finally returned, she was accompanied by a middle-aged man in a tailored suit who introduced himself as Greg Wallace, the board's president. "Ms. Brooks," he said, extending a hand. Melanie shook it reluctantly, her irritation bubbling just below the surface. "I understand you have some concerns about the community project in your backyard." "It's not a community project," Melanie snapped. "It's my property, and I never gave permission for anyone to build anything there. I've checked my documents, and there's no easement or shared use agreement." Greg gestured for her to follow him into a small conference room. "Let's sit down and discuss this," he said smoothly. Once they were seated, he pulled out a folder of his own and opened it to reveal a set of plans labeled Neighborhood Recreation Initiative. This project was approved by the board last year, Greg explained. It's part of a larger effort to enhance community amenities. According to the records, your property falls under an easement that allows for recreational use by the association. Melanie shook her head, her anger rising. That's impossible. I've reviewed my deed and every document I was given when I bought the house. There's no mention of any easement. Greg gave her a patronizing smile. Our bylaws were updated recently, and it's possible the previous owner didn't inform you of the changes. I'd be happy to provide you with a copy of the revised rules. Melanie felt her jaw tighten. Even if that's true, don't you think I should have been notified before construction started? This is my home, not some public park. We did send out notices, Greg replied. They went out months ago, along with the annual newsletter. Perhaps you missed it. Melanie leaned forward, her voice low and sharp. I didn't miss anything, and if you think you can steamroll me with some technicality, you're mistaken. That construction has already damaged my property, and I'm holding the board accountable for every dollar it's going to cost to fix it. Greg's smile faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly. I understand your frustration, Ms. Brooks. Let me look into this further and get back to you. In the meantime, I suggest we hold off on any drastic actions. These projects are for the benefit of the entire community, after all. Melanie stood, clutching her folder tightly. You'd better get back to me soon. If I don't hear from you, I'll take this to court. Greg's expression remained calm, but there was a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. Of course, we'll be in touch. Melanie left the office feeling no closer to a resolution. As she drove home, her mind raced with questions. How had this project been approved without her consent? Could the bylaws really have been changed without her knowledge? And if so, what else had the board decided they could take from her? When she arrived home, she found her backyard in even worse condition than before. The construction crew had removed a large section of her fence to make room for equipment, leaving her property exposed. Deep tire ruts marred the lawn, and the pile of dirt had grown even larger. To her horror, she noticed water pooling near the foundation of her house, seeping into the basement. Rushing inside, Melanie opened the door to the basement and was hit by the damp, musty smell of wet concrete. A thin layer of water covered the floor, and small streams trickled down the walls. Her heart sank as she realized the extent of the damage. She immediately called a plumber and a contractor to assess the situation, knowing this was going to be a costly and time-consuming nightmare. By the time the plumber arrived, the water level had risen enough to soak several boxes of belongings she had stored in the basement. The plumber confirmed her worst fears: the construction work had disrupted the drainage system, causing water to back up and flood the basement. Melanie felt a mix of anger and helplessness as she surveyed the damage. She knew she couldn't fight this alone, but she wasn't sure where to turn. The board had already shown they were more interested in protecting their project than addressing her concerns. If she didn't act quickly, she risked losing not just her basement, but her entire sense of security in the home she had worked so hard to build. Melanie Brooks felt like her world was unraveling as she stood ankle-deep in the flooded basement, her breath catching in her throat from the overwhelming smell of mildew and damp concrete. The plumber she had called was crouched near the foundation wall, shaking his head as he examined the extent of the water damage. This isn't just a leaky pipe or a clogged drain, he said grimly, gesturing toward the small streams trickling down the walls. Your drainage system has been completely compromised. The soil around your foundation is oversaturated, and the pressure is forcing water through every crack and seam. Whoever's digging up your yard is redirecting all that runoff straight into your house. Melanie pressed her palms against her temples, trying to suppress the rising panic. Can you fix it? She asked, though she already knew the answer wasn't going to be simple. The plumber stood and wiped his hands on a rag. You'll need a full-scale waterproofing job. A sump pump, new drainage lines, the whole works. But unless you stop whatever's going on outside, it'll just happen again. You're looking at tens of thousands of dollars, minimum. The words hit her like a gut punch. She thanked the plumber, paid for the consultation, and watched him leave, her mind spinning. The construction outside wasn't just an inconvenience anymore, it was a direct threat to her home and her finances. She couldn't afford to sit back and wait for the board's hollow promises to materialize. If she didn't act now, the damage would only escalate. Melanie spent the next few hours researching local property laws and contractors who specialized in stormwater management. She needed evidence, hard facts that proved the construction was the root cause of the flooding. Her first step was hiring an independent surveyor to assess her property and the surrounding area. The surveyor, a no-nonsense woman named Linda, arrived the next morning with a clipboard, measuring tools, and a sharp eye for details. Linda spent hours examining the site, taking soil samples, and mapping out the flow of water across the property. When she finally finished, her expression was grim. "The problem is obvious," she said, pointing to the torn-up yard and the partially constructed water slide. "That slide is positioned directly over a natural drainage path. It's redirecting rainwater and runoff straight toward your foundation. Whoever designed this either didn't do their homework or didn't care." Melanie felt a mix of validation and fury. "Can you put that in a report?" she asked. Linda nodded. "I'll have it ready by the end of the week. But let me give you some advice. You're dealing with a serious liability here. If the association refuses to address it, you're well within your rights to take legal action. This isn't just negligence, it's reckless." With the surveyor's findings in motion, Melanie turned her attention back to the board. She drafted a formal letter, attaching photos of the damage, preliminary findings from Linda, and a demand for immediate action. She hand-delivered the letter to the association office, ensuring it wouldn't get lost like her previous calls and messages. The receptionist looked startled when Melanie slammed the folder onto the counter. "This needs to go to Greg Wallace immediately," Melanie said, her voice steely. "I'm not leaving until I get confirmation that he's seen it." The receptionist hesitated, but after a tense silence, she nodded and disappeared into the back office. Melanie waited, tapping her fingers against the counter, every second feeling like an eternity. When the receptionist finally returned, she handed Melanie a receipt acknowledging the letter's delivery. "Mr. Wallace will review this and get back to you," she said in a clipped tone. Melanie left the office feeling a flicker of hope. She had taken the first steps toward holding the board accountable, but deep down, she knew this was only the beginning of a long fight. The next morning, she awoke to an unfamiliar sound outside, a dull, mechanical whirring. Pulling on a jacket, she stepped out onto her patio and froze. A new crew of workers was back in her yard, not continuing the waterslide construction, but digging deeper trenches near her property line. Large machines hummed as they carved out paths for what appeared to be additional drainage systems. "What the hell are you doing now?" Melanie shouted as she marched toward the foreman. He looked up from his clipboard, clearly annoyed by the interruption. "We're installing supplemental drainage to mitigate runoff from the slide," he said, as if it were the most reasonable thing in the world. "It's part of the project plan." Melanie's jaw tightened. "You're not solving the problem, you're making it worse. That water is still going to flood my basement." The foreman shrugged. "I'm just following orders, lady. If you've got an issue, take it up with the board." Melanie's hands curled into fists at her sides. "I already have, and they haven't done a damn thing. Get off my property before I call the police." The foreman raised an eyebrow, clearly unfazed by her threat. "You do that. But good luck getting them to side with you when this is all association approved." Melanie stormed back into the house, her frustration boiling over. She felt trapped, as if every avenue she tried to pursue was blocked by bureaucratic red tape and dismissive indifference. It wasn't just about the construction or the flooding anymore, it was about the principle. This was her home, her sanctuary, and she wasn't going to let anyone take that away from her. That evening, Melanie received an email from Greg Wallace. The tone was infuriatingly polite but devoid of any real substance. He acknowledged her concerns and assured her that the board was exploring potential solutions to address the issues caused by the project. No timeline, no concrete actions, just empty words designed to placate her. Melanie wasn't having it. She forwarded the email to Linda, the surveyor, and asked her to expedite the final report. She also began reaching out to legal professionals, determined to build a case against the board if they continued to ignore her. As the days passed, the flooding worsened. Each rainfall brought more water into her basement, soaking the walls and leaving behind a musty stench that seeped into every corner of the house. Melanie worked tirelessly to salvage her belongings, moving boxes and furniture to higher ground and throwing out items that were beyond saving. One night, as she was dragging a waterlogged box out of the basement, she heard a knock at the door. Opening it, she found a man standing on her porch, holding a clipboard. He introduced himself as a representative from the construction company. "We're here to discuss a settlement," he said, his tone smooth but insincere. Melanie narrowed her eyes. "Settlement for what?" "For the inconvenience caused by the project," he replied. "The board has authorized us to offer you compensation for any damages." Melanie's gut told her this wasn't a genuine attempt to make amends. "I don't want compensation," she said coldly. "I want you to stop destroying my property and fix what you've already ruined." The man's smile faltered. "With all due respect, ma'am, this is a generous offer. If you refuse, the board may not be so accommodating in the future." Melanie crossed her arms, her voice like ice. "Tell the board I'm not interested in their hush money. They'll be hearing from my lawyer." The man's expression darkened, but he said nothing further. As he walked away, Melanie felt a surge of determination. She wasn't going to let them intimidate her. She had come too far to back down now. For the first time in weeks, she felt a glimmer of hope. The board might have underestimated her resolve, but they were about to find out just how far she was willing to go to protect her home. Melanie sat at her kitchen table, staring at the email from Linda, the surveyor. Attached to it was the final report outlining the severe drainage issues caused by the construction in her backyard. Melanie had been waiting anxiously for this report, hoping it would be the solid proof she needed to confront the association. The words on the screen were damning. Linda's detailed analysis painted a clear picture of negligence. The excavation work for the water slide had blocked natural drainage paths, redirected runoff toward Melanie's property, and caused extensive damage to her foundation. The report also noted that the construction crew had failed to follow basic safety and environmental protocols, increasing the risk of long-term structural issues for her home. Her hands trembled as she scrolled through the document, but her resolve hardened with every paragraph. This wasn't just an inconvenience anymore, it was an assault on her rights as a homeowner. She immediately forwarded the report to Greg Wallace, the board president, along with a sharply worded email demanding immediate action. Melanie didn't mince words. She outlined every violation, attached photos of her flooded basement, and warned that she would not hesitate to escalate the matter legally if her demands were ignored again. Less than an hour later, her phone rang. It was Greg Wallace. His voice was calm, almost too calm, as if he were trying to defuse a bomb. "Ms. Brooks." He began, "I've received your email and the report from your surveyor. I understand your frustration, and I want to assure you that the board is taking this matter very seriously." Melanie cut him off. "Taking it seriously? Mr. Wallace, you've ignored my concerns for weeks while my basement floods, my property is torn apart, and my expenses skyrocket. What exactly does taking it seriously mean to you?" Greg cleared his throat, his tone shifting slightly. "We're currently reviewing the situation and exploring options to address the drainage issues. However, I must remind you that the water slide project was approved through proper channels, and any alterations to the site plan would require further review by the board." Melanie's frustration boiled over. "Proper channels? Are you seriously trying to justify this? My home is being destroyed because your board didn't bother to consider the consequences of this project. If you think I'm going to sit around and wait for more reviews, you're mistaken. Fix this now, or I'll take you and your board to court." Greg paused for a moment, as if weighing his next words carefully. "Ms. Brooks, I understand your position, but these processes take time. I'd like to propose a meeting with the board to discuss this further. Perhaps we can find a solution that works for everyone." Melanie didn't trust him, but she knew a face-to-face meeting could give her the chance to confront the entire board and present her case directly. "Fine," she said curtly. "Set it up. But if I don't see real action after this meeting, I'll move forward with legal action." The meeting was scheduled for the following week. In the meantime, Melanie decided to prepare as thoroughly as possible. She printed copies of Linda's report, photos of the damage, and excerpts from the association's bylaws that clearly stated homeowners were responsible for maintaining drainage systems on their properties. If the board was going to argue that this mess wasn't their fault, she would make it impossible for them to deny their negligence. When the day of the meeting arrived, Melanie felt a mix of nerves and determination. She entered the association's conference room to find the entire board seated at a long table, their faces carefully neutral. Greg Wallace sat at the head of the table, his expression calm and composed. A few of the other board members offered polite smiles, but most avoided eye contact. Melanie took a seat at the opposite end of the table, placing her folder of evidence in front of her. "Thank you for coming," M.S. Brooks Gregg began. "We appreciate the opportunity to address your concerns." Melanie didn't waste any time. She opened her folder and began laying out her case. She presented Linda's report, the photos, and the documented violations of environmental and safety standards. Her voice was steady but firm as she described the flooding, the structural damage to her home, and the mounting costs she was being forced to bear. By the time she finished, the room was silent. One of the board members, a woman named Janet, finally spoke up. "M.S. Brooks, while we sympathize with your situation, the water slide project was approved with the understanding that it would benefit the entire community. These types of initiatives are never without challenges." Melanie narrowed her eyes. "Challenges? My home is uninhabitable. My basement is flooded, and the damage is getting worse every day. This isn't a challenge, it's a disaster caused by your negligence." Greg held up a hand, signaling for calm. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves. We've reviewed the surveyor's report, and while it raises some valid concerns, we also need to consider the broader context. The water slide project is a major investment for the community, and halting construction could result in significant financial losses." Melanie leaned forward, her voice cold. "You're worried about financial losses? What about the financial losses I'm facing because of this? Or does the board not care about individual homeowners as long as the community benefits?" Greg didn't respond immediately, but another board member, a younger man named Ethan, spoke up. "M.S. Brooks, if I may, the board is willing to consider compensating you for some of the damages. It's not uncommon for projects like this to have unforeseen consequences, and we're prepared to work with you to find a resolution." Melanie's stomach twisted. She could see where this was going. "Compensation," she repeated. "So you think you can pay me off and keep going as if nothing happened? That's not good enough. I want the construction stopped, the drainage issues fixed, and my property restored." Ethan shifted uncomfortably. "We'll need to consult with our legal team before making any commitments, but I think we can agree to take immediate steps to mitigate the flooding." Melanie could feel the frustration rising again. Mitigation isn't enough. This project is fundamentally flawed. If you don't stop it now, the damage will only get worse for me and for anyone else nearby. The tension in the room was palpable. Greg finally spoke, his tone measured. "M.S. Brooks, I understand your passion, but these decisions are not made lightly. We need time to evaluate all the factors involved. I assure you, the board will do everything in its power to address your concerns." Melanie didn't believe a word of it, but she realized she wasn't going to get a definitive answer today. As the meeting ended, Greg promised to follow up with a timeline for next steps. Melanie left the conference room feeling a mix of anger and exhaustion. She had made her case, but it was clear the board wasn't going to act unless they were forced to. That evening, Melanie received an unexpected email from an anonymous sender. The message was short but chilling. "Be careful. They won't let you win." Attached to the email was a scanned copy of a document labeled Project Budget Breakdown. Melanie's heart raced as she opened the attachment. The document revealed that the water slide project was far more expensive than the board had disclosed. It also showed suspicious payments to a construction firm linked to Greg Wallace's brother-in-law. Melanie stared at the screen, her mind racing. This was the proof she needed, not just of negligence but of corruption. But if the anonymous email was any indication, exposing the truth could come at a cost. For the first time, Melanie realized just how high the stakes were, and how far the board might go to protect their interests. Melanie stared at the leaked document on her laptop, the details leaping off the page with horrifying clarity. The payments to Greg Wallace's brother-in-law weren't just suspicious, they were blatant evidence of corruption. The construction costs for the water slide project were inflated beyond reason, with tens of thousands of dollars allocated to vague consultation fees and special permits. This wasn't just negligence, it was a scheme. The board had approved a project that destroyed her property, all to funnel money into their own pockets. Her first instinct was to send the document to Linda, the surveyor, and her lawyer, but she hesitated. The anonymous warning still hung in her mind, be careful, they won't let you win. Someone had risked a lot to send her this information, and whoever they were, they seemed to understand the stakes better than she did. Melanie's hands hovered over her keyboard, indecision gnawing at her. If she went public with this, she wouldn't just be fighting for her home anymore, she'd be taking on an entire network of corruption. Before she could make a decision, a loud knock at the door startled her. She closed the laptop quickly and went to answer it, her heart pounding. Two men in dark jackets stood on her porch, their expressions unreadable. One of them held a clipboard. "Ms. Brooks," the man with the clipboard asked. "Yes," she said cautiously. "We're here to conduct an inspection on behalf of the community board," he said. "It's a routine assessment related to the ongoing construction." Melanie frowned. "An inspection?" At this hour she glanced at the clock. It was nearly 8 p.m. The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "We've had a lot of complaints about the worksite and want to ensure everything is in compliance. May we come in to take a look at your basement?" Every instinct in Melanie screamed that something was off. "You'll need to schedule that with me during normal hours," she said firmly. "I wasn't notified about any inspection, and I'm not letting you in without proper notice." The men exchanged a glance, and the one without the clipboard took a step closer. "We're just trying to help, Ms. Brooks. If you've got nothing to hide, this won't take long." Melanie's hand tightened on the doorknob. "If you don't leave now, I'll call the police," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. The man with the clipboard raised his hands in mock surrender. "No need for that. We'll come back another time." They turned and walked away, but Melanie didn't feel relieved. She locked the door and double-checked all the windows, her mind racing. Who were they, really? And how had they known to come right after she'd received the leaked document? The next morning, Melanie forwarded the document to her lawyer, outlining her concerns about its legitimacy and the possible retaliation she might face for using it. Her lawyer, a pragmatic woman named Camille, responded quickly. "This is powerful evidence," Camille wrote. "But it's also dangerous. If we bring this into a lawsuit, the board will fight back hard. You need to be prepared for escalation, financial, legal, and possibly personal." Melanie didn't need to be told twice. That same day, she hired a contractor to install security cameras around her property. If the board or their contractors tried to intimidate her again, she wanted it all on record. The cameras were installed by the evening, covering every angle of her house and backyard. For the first time in weeks, Melanie felt a small sense of control returning. But the reprieve didn't last. 2 days later, she woke up to the sound of rushing water. Her stomach dropped as she ran to the basement door, already fearing the worst. When she opened it, she was greeted by a wave of cold, muddy water rushing across the floor. The flooding was worse than ever, and the water was rising fast. Frantically, she grabbed her phone and called the contractor she'd hired to assess the damage. When he arrived, his face turned grim as he examined the basement. "This isn't just runoff," he said. "It looks like someone deliberately tampered with your drainage system." Melanie's blood ran cold. "Tampered? You mean someone did this on purpose?" He nodded. "The pipes leading from your property were blocked concrete debris, rocks and other junk shoved in there to prevent water from escaping. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing." Melanie's fists clenched. This wasn't just about the water slide anymore. Someone was trying to break her, to force her to give up and back down. But instead of fear, she felt a surge of defiance. If they thought they could bully her into submission, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. She sent a detailed report of the sabotage to Camille, who wasted no time filing an emergency motion against the board. The motion demanded an immediate halt to all construction and an independent investigation into the damage caused by the project. Melanie knew this was a gamble. If the motion was denied, it would give the board even more time to cover their tracks, but she also knew she had no other choice. The day after the motion was filed, Melanie received a visit from Greg Wallace himself. He arrived unannounced, his polished demeanor masking the tension in his voice. "Miss Brooks," he said, standing on her front porch with his hands clasped. "I wanted to speak with you directly about the situation. I think we've allowed this to get more contentious than it needs to be." Melanie crossed her arms, blocking the doorway. "Contentious? My basement is flooded, my property is destroyed, and your board is to blame. What exactly are you offering, Mr. Wallace?" Greg's smile faltered. "We're willing to offer a substantial settlement to cover your damages and ensure the project is completed without further issues. This doesn't have to escalate any further." Melanie's eyes narrowed. "A settlement? You think you can buy me off while your contractors sabotage my home? I know about the payments to your brother-in-law. I know about the inflated budget. Do you really think I'm going to let this slide?" Greg's expression hardened, the veneer of politeness slipping. "You're making this harder than it needs to be, Ms. Brooks. Think carefully about your next steps. Sometimes, fighting the system does more harm than good." Melanie stepped closer, her voice steady and cold. "Get off my property, Mr. Wallace, and tell your board that I'm not going anywhere." As Greg walked back to his car, Melanie felt the weight of the confrontation settle on her shoulders. She knew the board wouldn't back down easily, but neither would she. That night, she reviewed the security footage from her cameras, searching for any evidence of who might have sabotaged her drainage system. To her shock, the footage from 2 nights earlier showed a group of workers sneaking onto her property under cover of darkness. They carried tools and heavy bags, spending hours near her drainage pipes before disappearing into the night. Melanie downloaded the footage and sent it to Camille, knowing this was the smoking gun they needed. But even as she prepared to fight back, a nagging thought lingered in the back of her mind. If the board was willing to go this far to silence her, what would they do next? For the first time, Melanie realized that protecting her home might come at a far greater cost than she'd ever anticipated. Melanie paced her living room, the tension in her chest tightening with every passing minute. The footage she had sent to Camille was damning. The shadowy figures tampering with her drainage pipes were clear evidence of deliberate sabotage. It was the proof they needed to hold the board accountable, and Camille had promised to include it in an emergency filing the next morning. But even with this new leverage, Melanie couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to escalate further. Her instincts proved correct. That evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, a black SUV pulled up in front of her house. Melanie tensed as Greg Wallace stepped out, accompanied by 2 men she didn't recognize, both tall, broad, and exuding the kind of quiet menace that sent a chill down her spine. Greg walked up to her door and knocked, his expression calm but his posture rigid. She opened the door just enough to speak through the gap. "What do you want, Greg?" "Ms. Brooks," he said, his tone measured. "We need to have a conversation. May we come in?" Melanie's grip on the door tightened. "Absolutely not. If you have something to say, you can say it from the porch." Greg sighed, glancing at the men behind him, as if for reassurance. "Fine. I'll get to the point. The evidence you submitted, both the surveyor's report and that footage, has the potential to create unnecessary conflict. The board believes it would be in everyone's best interest to resolve this amicably before things spiral out of control." Melanie narrowed her eyes. "Amicably? You mean you want me to drop my case and look the other way while my home is destroyed?" Greg's expression hardened, the mask of civility slipping. "I'm offering you a way out, Ms. Brooks. A generous settlement, enough to cover your damages and then some. All you have to do is withdraw your complaint and sign a non-disclosure agreement. This doesn't have to turn into a drawn-out legal battle." Melanie let out a bitter laugh. "You mean a cover-up? You're not worried about me, you're worried about what happens when everyone finds out what you've been doing with the association's funds." Greg took a step closer, lowering his voice. "Be reasonable. You're one person up against a well-funded organization. Do you really think you can win? You could spend years fighting this, rack up legal fees, and still end up losing everything. Is that what you want? Melanie felt a surge of anger, but she kept her voice steady. You've already underestimated me, Greg. I'm not backing down. So unless you have a court order or a valid reason to be here, I suggest you leave my property. Greg's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he might lash out. But instead, he forced a thin smile. You're making a mistake, he said quietly. I hope you're ready to deal with the consequences. Without another word, he turned and walked back to the CV, his two companions following close behind. Melanie locked the door and watched through the window as the vehicle disappeared down the street. Her hands were shaking, but her resolve was stronger than ever. That night, the storm hit. Rain poured down in sheets, hammering against the windows and turning her backyard into a muddy swamp. Melanie stayed up late, monitoring the security cameras and checking the basement for signs of flooding. Around midnight, she spotted movement on one of the camera feeds, a figure in a raincoat darting toward her backyard. Her heart raced as she watched the figure crouch near the drainage system, pulling something out of a bag. Melanie grabbed her phone and called the police, her voice steady but urgent as she described the trespasser. While she waited for them to arrive, she kept her eyes glued to the screen, watching as the figure worked quickly, seemingly unaware of the cameras. When the police finally pulled up, their flashing lights illuminated the figure, who froze mid-action. Two officers approached, shouting commands, and the person reluctantly raised their hands. Melanie watched from the window as they escorted the individual to the front yard. One of the officers knocked on her door, and she quickly opened it, still clutching her phone. Ms. Brooks, the officer said, "We've detained the suspect. It looks like they were tampering with your drainage system again. Do you want to press charges?" "Yes," Melanie said without hesitation, "and I have footage of what they were doing." The officer nodded. "We'll need to take a look at that. It might also help identify if this is connected to the previous issues you reported." As the officers took the figure into custody, Melanie felt a mix of relief and vindication. Whoever was behind this was finally being held accountable, or so she thought. The next morning, Camille called with an update. "The police report will help our case, but I have to warn you the board's legal team is pushing back hard. They're claiming the footage is inadmissible because it was recorded without explicit notice to the contractors." Melanie groaned. "Are they serious? These people were trespassing on my property." "They're grasping at straws," Camille assured her. "It's a stalling tactic. They know we have the upper hand, and they're trying to delay the inevitable. But the motion for the injunction is moving forward, and with the police report, we're in a strong position." By the time the court hearing arrived a week later, Melanie felt like she had been fighting this battle for months. The board's legal team tried every tactic to discredit her claims, from challenging the surveyor's credentials to arguing that the construction was authorized under association bylaws. But Camille was relentless, methodically dismantling each argument with evidence and testimony. The turning point came when the police report and security footage were presented. The judge watched the video of the trespasser tampering with the drainage system, their actions clear and deliberate. Combined with the surveyor's report and the financial discrepancies uncovered in the leaked document, it painted an undeniable picture of negligence, corruption, and intimidation. When the judge issued the ruling, Melanie felt a wave of relief. The court ordered an immediate halt to the construction, mandated repairs to her property at the association's expense, and opened the door for a broader investigation into the board's activities. Greg Wallace's expression was a mix of fury and defeat as he left the courtroom without a word. That evening, Melanie stood in her backyard, the torn-up ground now eerily quiet. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to breathe. The fight wasn't completely over. There were still repairs to be made, and the investigation into the board would likely drag on, but for now she had won. Her home, her sanctuary, was hers again. In the days following the court's decision, Melanie finally felt the weight of the battle begin to lift. The construction crew had been ordered to dismantle the water slide, and repair work on her drainage system started immediately under court-appointed oversight. Watching the brightly colored pieces of the slide being hauled away in trucks felt like reclaiming a piece of her life that had been stolen. The repairs weren't quick or easy. The damage to her property was extensive, and Melanie spent hours reviewing contractor estimates and overseeing the work to ensure it was done correctly. The basement, which had become a swamp during the worst of the flooding, was gutted and waterproofed. A new drainage system was installed, with additional safeguards to prevent future issues. Melanie decided to rebuild the basement office she had dreamed of, not just as a workspace but as a symbol of her perseverance. Throughout the process, neighbors began approaching her hesitant at first, but eventually more candid. Several admitted that they, too, had been pressured by the board or had noticed suspicious discrepancies in association fees and projects. A retired teacher from down the street shared how she had been fined repeatedly for trivial violations, while another homeowner revealed how the board had strong-armed them into signing over part of their yard for community use. "I didn't think anyone could fight back against them," one neighbor said, shaking her head in disbelief. "But you actually did it." Melanie found unexpected camaraderie in these conversations. For weeks, she had felt isolated and vilified, but now, she realized she wasn't alone. The board's corruption had affected many people in the neighborhood. They had simply been too afraid to speak out. Greg Wallace, however, wasn't done. News broke that he had resigned as president of the association following the court ruling, but not before making a public statement blaming Melanie for the divisive atmosphere in the community. His words rang hollow, especially after local journalists began uncovering more of his shady dealings. The leaked financial documents Melanie had received were just the tip of the iceberg, and the subsequent investigation revealed years of embezzlement and fraud tied to Greg and several other board members. With the old leadership dismantled, the neighborhood held an emergency election to appoint new representatives. Melanie was approached by several neighbors who urged her to run, but she declined. She had no interest in becoming part of the system she had fought so hard against. Instead, she helped support a group of homeowners who wanted to create a more transparent and accountable board. As the repairs to her home were completed, Melanie began to feel a sense of closure. Her basement, once a source of despair, was transformed into the office she had always envisioned: bright, airy, and filled with personal touches that made it uniquely hers. She hung a framed photo of her parents above the desk, a reminder of the resilience they had instilled in her. One evening, as she sat on her newly restored patio, sipping a glass of wine, she watched the neighborhood settle into a peaceful quiet. The lights in her backyard flickered on, illuminating the perfectly landscaped garden she had worked so hard to reclaim. It felt like the first time in months that she could truly relax. Her phone buzzed on the table, a message from Camille. "Just heard from the investigator. Greg Wallace has been indicted. Looks like he's finally getting what he deserves. Congrats again on everything. You've earned this." Melanie smiled, the tension in her chest finally dissipating. She had won not just for herself but for the neighborhood. The victory wasn't just about her home, it was about standing up to people who thought they could trample over others without consequence. As the stars began to dot the sky, Melanie leaned back in her chair, breathing in the crisp night air. Her home was hers again, and this time no one would take it from her.